Hi, it's Dwyer. It's December 14th, 2024. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. We're going to discuss some controversial subject matter in this YouTube video, so remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, I've been having a fascinating, at least to me, dialogue with my subscribers here online, where I've made the argument that age is overrated in terms of figuring out whether or not a fighter is competitive. Right? So I've gotten a number of responses. This is over a few videos going back several weeks. I've gotten a number of responses, especially since I picked Mike Tyson to beat Jake Paul, which did not happen. And people are telling me, Dwyer, you don't understand. There are physiological changes that take place as a person ages. Somebody else has suggested that I have an affinity to the athletes who were dominant when I was younger, and I don't realize that a younger generation has taken over, etc. Let's discuss it. Understand, I believe that you have your best profit opportunities on the edge, right? When you see a truth that the public narrative does not see or does not embrace. Right now, let me just say, I'm not suggesting that age doesn't matter at all. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting is that it doesn't matter in heavyweight boxing or with very talented fighters with certain skills as much as people think. Right? As I sit here, and don't get me wrong, there are many fights where I'm watching the fight and I'm thinking to myself, this is not playing out the way I thought. Right? Whoever wins the fight, even if it's the guy I picked, I was wrong in thinking how this fight was going to be. Right? There's several fights like that. I'm still not convinced by the Mike Tyson-Jake Paul outcome. Right? Tyson enters the ring. He's biting his gloves. He has a problem with a perfectly fitting mouthpiece. Even when he entered the ring, you noticed there was a certain lack of energy. Right? They gave him a great ring intro, and you just got the feeling before the first punch was thrown that Mike wasn't all there. Right? You see Jake Paul moving around the ring. Jake Paul is not exactly Ali moving around the ring. It's not like if a fighter steps forward on him, they're getting hit with a bunch of shots, whether or not Jake Paul is standing still or moving. Right? Jake Paul, quite frankly, is just learning his back foot. Right now, what I realize is that when an event, a highly watched event like that takes place, people reach conclusions, then they start following crowds. Right? These are the passive investors in traditional finance. Right? These are the people who, are buying indexes in traditional finance. Different parts of, our culture cater to this group mindset. Right now, let me point out, I'm acutely aware, particularly being a baseball fan, that as athletes age, their batting average might drop. The velocity on their fastball might drop. It can be measured. Right? I'm aware of the fact that it's very hard to be a running back in the National Football League when you're over 30. Unless, of course, you're a workout fiend like a Derrick Henry or someone like that. Right? I'm aware of that. But let's talk boxing. What I'm also aware of is in boxing, styles make fights. In boxing, if you have a great jab and you know how to throw it, and if you know how to be defensive, whatever your construct is, right? You could be a Dmitry Bivol and catch shots on your forearm, right? Bivol caught so many shots on his hands, which he had raised to his face, that his face got marked up in the Beterbiev fight. You could do it that way. You could do it the Larry Holmes way. Have your hands down around your waist, use movement, keep the other guy turning, have the other guy missing. As long as you have a defensive construct and you know what you're doing, you can neutralize youth more in boxing than you can in other sports. Right? It's akin to a pocket quarterback in the National Football League. Right? You can actually have a career that makes it into your 40s. If, like Tom Brady, from the pocket, you can quickly read a defense. You know where you're going to go with the football. You're not a running quarterback. You're not taking a lot of hits. Rather, you're getting rid of the ball quickly. Right? Understand, Dan Marino, if he did not suffer that Achilles injury, Marino could have played several more years. He had the quick release. He could quickly read defenses. He could quickly get rid of the ball. He wasn't trying to outrun anyone. Right? Understand, the career of someone like that has a different trajectory than, let's say, the career of a running quarterback, an RG3. Someone whose game involves a lot of outrunning linebackers. So let's talk boxing. I raised something that people found to be preposterous. That's okay. I've won on preposterous bets. Right? What I want people to realize is that that film footage, and it's incredible film footage of Ray Mercer beating up Tommy Morrison, right? Morrison was a physical specimen. We now understand that he was juicing, right? Let me make another basic point. Back in the 80s and 90s, when we did not fully understand juicing, several fighters were juicing. You can tell that by looking at the fighter today, right, post-career, on how their bodies have thinned out, right? Several football players were juicing. Same thing. You can just tell looking at how the athlete has gone into his post-playing life, right? So, in fact, if you recall the Olympics, people of a generation remember the East German women, right? You had Olympic Games where the East German women didn't even look like the other women. This is in the 70s. Then, of course, we found out that they were systematically juicing, right? East Germany, of course, is no longer with us. What used to be state secrets are now public knowledge. So let me point out, Tommy Morrison was juicing. He fought Ray Mercer. It's a famous fight. I encourage you to pull up the footage of that fight. Mercer knocked him out. It's a brutal knockout. Mercer looked like a world beater. Mercer's next fight was against Larry Holmes, who was several years removed from being heavyweight champion. Holmes had gotten knocked out by Tyson. Understand, the Holmes-Tyson fight, look at the chronology, took place over a year after Larry had left the sport. Right, folks, the Larry Holmes-Ray Mercer fight, to those of you who use age as a proxy to determine ability, How do you explain the fact that the Ray Mercer who the fight before destroyed Tommy Morrison lost by a few rounds, to Larry Holmes? Folks, it's Ray Mercer's first loss. Understand, after Larry Holmes beats Ray Mercer, Mercer goes on to have a very good career. He fights Lennox Lewis afterwards. This is prime Lewis. Right? Lewis, of course, Hall of Famer. And, of course, he gives Lewis one of the toughest fights of Lewis's career. Folks, you didn't know who won that fight until the judges' scorecards were read. The point I'm making is we view boxing as fighting. It's more than that. It's actually a craft. So you get in the ring with the Larry Holmes, and you look at Larry. Larry didn't exactly look like Anthony Joshua. Larry didn't look like his contemporary Ken Norton. Right? Larry had what we call now a dad bod. You look at a Larry Holmes, you say, wow, he's not ripped up. Wow, this guy has a lot of miles on the tire. Right? Understand, Larry, believe it or not, was actually on the card for the Thriller in Manila. Right? Larry, was around for years. You're fighting Larry Holmes in the late 80s, early 90s, after Larry had been retired from the sport. And I'm sure Mercer thought, gee, I'm a physical specimen. I just destroyed Tommy Morrison. How is this old man gonna beat me? Right? Again, boxing's a craft. Mercer's coming forward. He's getting hit with a stiff jab. Mercer's trying to corner Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes has lateral movement. Larry Holmes knows the things that cagey vets know. Larry, of course, is in the Hall of Fame now. Right? Ray Mercer doesn't come close to knocking out Larry Holmes. The old man beats him because the old man knew the craft better. Now, that's not to suggest that the Larry Holmes who beat Ray Mercer would have beaten a younger version of Larry Holmes. Right? Age does matter. Right? There comes a time where the version of you who knows more, but who is less physically capable, will lose to the version of yourself who knows less, but who is more physically capable because you're younger, fresher reflexes. I recognize that completely. But what I also recognize is you take a Vladimir Klitschko today, right, in Klitschko's late 40s. You take a Vladimir Klitschko today, if he has stayed in the gym, if he has been physically active, if he hasn't spent his retirement on his porch chugging six-packs, right? If he's still in the gym, and Tom Loeffler of K2 says that Vladimir is still in shape. You remember Vladimir Klitschko, hardly any body fat on him. I'm just saying that Vladimir Klitschko has a jab that is at least Joe Joyce level. Against a young guy like a Daniel Dubois, who gives away rounds. Isn't that what he did at the beginning of the Joe Joyce fight? Isn't that what he did at the beginning of the Usyk fight? You get a cagey vet like Vladimir Klitschko who's going to stick a jab in his face, who has power, right? It's not my insight, it's long-time boxing thought that power is the last to go, right? As I've said here before, if I were some roughneck and I were looking for an older guy to rob, if I saw George Foreman standing on a corner, even knowing that Foreman is a multi-millionaire, probably made a lot more money than Ali, right? Let's remember the Foreman grill, right? Let's remember the Foreman paydays when he came back. Foreman would be one of the last people I try to rob. In fact, there's stories of young guys trying to rob people like Jack Dempsey and Billy Kahn and getting rebuffed. Right? I have little doubt as I sit here, unless Vladimir Klitschko shows up and he's biting his glove. Right? He has something going on where he can't even keep his mouthpiece in his mouth. Unless something like that happens. A Vladimir Klitschko, Daniel Dubois fight, folks, today would be competitive. Right? Today would be competitive based on styles. Right? My point to you is that in boxing, unless a guy has some hidden injury, right? And understand, this is the sport where Harry Greb dies prematurely. Then in the autopsy, they realized that Harry Greb was blind in one eye. This is a Hall of Famer, one of the best fighters of his generation. Right? Joe Frazier retires from the sport. Then he starts talking about how he fought for several years blind in one eye. Then we start hearing that the Ali Frazier fight was supposed to take place at the Fabulous Forum in LA. Jack Kent Cooke was on board. But they realized that Joe Frazier, this is for the biggest fight of Frazier's career. Ali Frazier won. We realized that Joe Frazier couldn't pass the physical in LA because Joe Frazier was blind in one eye. So, of course, welcome to boxing. These well-connected people had a connection in New York, and Joe Frazier was able to fight Ali at Madison Square Garden. Right? Folks, the point I'm making is, absent some injury that directly impacts your performance, right? Larry Holmes had a bad eye. Right? Absent an injury like that, a well-preserved older guy can give younger guys all they can handle. Right? A Floyd Mayweather who understands sequencing. Understand, Mayweather, defensive wizard, understood how to box without putting himself in mortal danger. That's even against unorthodox sluggers like Marcus Maidana. Right? I know many of you look at that first Maidana fight and you have a problem with the scoring of that first Maidana fight. Okay, fair enough. Can we agree that that's an older Mayweather, and at a minimum, he's going the distance with Marcus Maidana? That's at a minimum. Right, folks? This older set is still dangerous. Joe Joyce today, and I know Joyce got knocked down by Derek Chisora. In my opinion, Joyce gave away that fight. Could have won the fight with a different strategy, right? Derek Chisora motions you to follow him over to the ropes in the later rounds. I thought Joyce was ahead at the time. Joyce could have waved at him like Pernell Whitaker waved at Julio Cesar Chavez, right? You don't have to follow a guy over to the corner, right? Look at the Jimmy Young-Ali fight. Well, all I'm saying is Joe Joyce is still dangerous. Joe Parker is fighting for the heavyweight championship. Even Joe Parker will tell you he lost the fight to Joe Joyce, right? Parker gets stopped in that fight. Joe Joyce has never relied on hand speed. Joe Joyce has an excellent jab. Right now, he made some matchmaking mistakes. Why would you ever fight Southpaw Zhili Zhang when you have that level of jab from a right-hand stance? Right? Joyce made mistakes. Joyce lost some fights. Right? Joe Joyce would still be dangerous to Daniel Dubois. Now, if you believe that, right, and understand, Joe Joyce, who we're marginalizing these days, has beaten Dubois and Joe Parker. And that's one of the next title fights. Right? A Joe Joyce is going to age well as long as he doesn't start showing punch resistance problems. Right? I want folks to look at Joe Joyce and realize that today, right, can we actually look at reality in coming up with our narratives? Today, you have some dangerous contenders. Zhili Zhang, who I just mentioned. Luis Ortiz. Right, folks? These are dangerous contenders who are well past 35 years old. Right? So, my point to you is the public right now, and let's face it, many of the public are casual fans. Right? They're going by public opinion. Right? They're the equivalent, again, of folks who are just investing in these index funds, where you buy every stock in an index. By the way, for those keeping track, MicroStrategy just got accepted to the NASDAQ 100. I can tell you here on a Saturday morning that that's going to jump Monday morning when markets open. Because a lot of people who barely know anything about MicroStrategy are going to know it's in the index. They need to load up. Right? They're going to buy it simply because everyone else is buying it, and the index has told them now this is an acceptable stock. Well, in boxing, there were a lot of people who said Tyson's too old. Right? Forget the fact that I think today Tyson hits harder than Jake Paul. Tyson's too old. Right? They skipped over the Roy Jones fight. Roy's moving well in that fight, folks. Right? I don't want to hear about Jake Paul being half Roy's age. Roy's moving well in the fight he had against Mike Tyson. Right? Tyson, of course, looked good against Roy, but in that fight, as Roy Jones has pointed out, Tyson's not munching on his glove. Tyson's not playing with his mouthpiece during the fight. Right? Tyson's head was in a different place for that Roy Jones fight than it was for the Jake Paul fight. So now's where you can make your money. People have been scared off. They saw Victor Belfort knock Evander Holyfield out of the ring. Right? They may have seen Joe Smith knock Bernard Hopkins out of the ring. They saw Mike Tyson look lethargic in going the distance against Jake Paul. Right? They probably think every fighter over 35 is going to be munching on their gloves and playing with their mouthpiece. Right? Many of these fans are younger. I remember I was in my 20s. I got invited to some party by some guy who was over 30. And I remember thinking, man, do I want to party with old people? Right? Now that I'm well past 30, let's just say I realized how foolish I was at the time. Right? But you know the rest. You're in your 20s. You're hanging out with other 20-year-olds. You're thinking to yourself, man, these 30-something-year-olds, they might as well be my mom and dad. They're all over the hill. Right? It just depends on your age point of view. Now, in boxing, just understand that some of the greats happen to be older fighters. Right, folks? Archie Moore is a knockout puncher. Understand, Archie Moore was a free spirit. So he came up with a defensive construct that was unusual, but it was highly effective. It allowed him to stay in the pocket and trade shots with people. Archie Moore, light heavyweight champion, older guy, fought Rocky Marciano and dropped him. Marciano gets off the canvas, the referee comes over. This is the stuff that makes boxing legend. The referee takes a moment to wipe off Marciano's gloves. Archie Moore went to his grave, believing that that referee cost Archie the heavyweight title, because Marciano, of course, then cleared his head. and was able to come back in the fight and stop Archie Moore. Right? George Foreman, the secret to Foreman is to look at the level at which Foreman was beaten up by young guys when he was in his 40s. Is there a Foreman fight where Foreman looks completely overwhelmed by the youth of his opponent? Folks, the answer is there isn't. Let me tell you how Foreman's career ends. He fights a prime Shannon Briggs. Now understand Shannon Briggs. I know today's generation sees these old men and can't even imagine these old men as athletes. Right? Shannon Briggs, according to Lennox Lewis, was the hardest puncher he ever faced. Well, prime Shannon Briggs fights George Foreman. It's Foreman's last fight. The fight goes the distance. Right? How is Foreman in against, name the fighter, Holyfield, Shannon Briggs, and he's going the distance? According to public narrative, he shouldn't even be in the ring. There's some states that will be hesitant to even give a boxing license to a fighter in his mid-40s. Right? So, boxing's rock, paper, scissors. I can tell you, Anthony Joshua, 5 years from now, is still going to be an outsized puncher. Right? That's whether or not he decides to continue in the sport. Right? If a Vladimir Klitschko has been staying sharp, and if a Vladimir Klitschko has been keeping that jab and the timing and the balance that supports that jab, right? Vladimir Klitschko would be the betting side of the play against a Daniel Dubois, because quite frankly, you'd probably be getting better than a plus 150. Right? Bet 100, win $150. Right? Understand, a Vladimir Klitschko, if he returns, you would have to think in terms of, the prop that says Klitschko by knockout, because you understand, a Vladimir Klitschko would only have to be right once. Now, that's not to suggest that Klitschko, once he hooks up with Emmanuel Stewart, right, that's when his career takes off. Right? That's not to say that younger version of Vladimir Klitschko wouldn't beat the Vladimir Klitschko today. Right? Age does matter. Just not as much as you think. Right? So let's pay close attention here. Mike Tyson has created an opening. People saw the Mike Tyson fight and they believe there is no way that a guy over 45 can be competitive. Right? What I want people to do is to look at Mario Barrios' face after the Abel Ramos fight. Right, folks? Just look at his face. Now, I thought Manny Pacquiao had a hard time against a kickboxer in his last fight. Right? But the one thing I know with certainty is that Pacquiao still hits hard. You even saw it in the kickboxer fight. Pacquiao still hits hard and he's sudden. If Abel Ramos was able to do a job on Mario Barrios' face, don't you think that if Pacquiao lands, Pacquiao's a guy who knocked down Chris Algieri, 5 or 6 times when they fought? If Manny Pacquiao lands it, Pacquiao dropped Keith Thurman. That's one of Pacquiao's last fights. Don't you think Mario Barrios, who got dropped and stopped by Gervonta Davis, could be in trouble? What are the odds that you believe you would get on Pacquiao against Mario Barrios? Folks, again, my threshold's a plus 150. I would expect to get a plus 200 or more on Manny Pacquiao in that fight. Now, here again, that's not to suggest that I would take Pacquiao against some of the young guns out there. Right, Pacquiao against Jaron Ennis? No thanks. I'm not going to touch that fight. Right, I believe Ennis would win that fight. Right, but pick the fighters. Daniel Dubois, I know he's blessed offensively. Right, he beat Philly Bergovic, who I thought was going to beat him. Right? I mean, understand, Dubois, I'm not saying he's not blessed offensively. But he has some holes in his game that have been exploited in the past. Right? If you believe that Joe Joyce, with a great jab, with timing, right, with an aggressive front foot, would give Dubois problems today. Joyce has already beaten Dubois. Then why can't Vladimir Klitschko? Right, folks, in Klitschko's last fight, he dropped Anthony Joshua. One of the mysteries in boxing is how Joshua was able to survive after getting dropped, because Joshua got up and he looked woozy and out of it. Right? Manny Pacquiao, folks, again, he dropped Keith Thurman. Sudden power from distance, and he's a southpaw. In other words, you don't have a lot of time to think. How are you going to get a sparring partner who's as quick, as sudden, as powerful as Manny Pacquiao? You might remember, too, Pacquiao's head movement. Pacquiao would come in, he'd be moving his head like this. Now, a Juan Manuel Marquez, these counterpuncher types who are looking at patterns and who know Pacquiao is predominantly one-handed, right? Even working with Freddie Roach after the El Terrible fight, Pacquiao still relies a lot on that straight left. We understand that, right? But just understand, Mario Barrios gets hit with shots. Mario Barrios has already lost to a shorter guy with an explosive left in Gervonta Davis. And Davis isn't remotely as sudden as Manny Pacquiao. Right? So all I'm saying is let's see how this unfolds. The Tyson fight has cast a cloud over the idea of young guys being competitive, older guys being competitive, even as Zhilei Zhang remains a major threat to the throne. Folks, you have younger heavyweights actively avoiding Luis Ortiz. And Ortiz's punch resistance has been negatively impacted by his age. But they saw Ortiz get off the canvas and give Andy Ruiz a hell of a fight. Right? A hell of a fight. Right? So all I'm saying is, if you're aware of the fact that we've had heavyweight champions in the past like Sonny Liston, who may have been as much as 10 years older than his listed weight. Right, folks? We don't have a birth certificate for Charles Sonny Liston. Right? If you go back in boxing history and you realize a lot of these fighters fought deep in their 30s, well into their 40s, and that these days fighters don't have the wear and tear that they had back in the days of Ray Robinson, when fighters often had careers where they fought 50, 60, 70 times. Right? Joe Louis had a bum of the month club. Right, folks? These days, you and I know heavyweight champs can fight once or twice a year and not get the wear and tear on their body. Vladimir Klitschko has been resting for several years. Right? If he comes back, and if he still has that jab, and if he still has the power, even if he doesn't have the punch resistance, isn't Dubois going to have to go through a few things to even land on Vladimir Klitschko? Right? Ask yourself, Kevin Lorena knocks down Dubois, what, 2 or 3 times in that fight? Right? Don't you think Vladimir Klitschko would be competitive with Kevin Lorena? If Vladimir Klitschko knocks down Daniel Dubois 2 or 3 times in a match, even if Dubois comes back and stops him, won't Vladimir Klitschko be validated? Won't some savvy bettors hit on some props? Won't that be a candidate for Fight of the Year? Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. Age does matter. Just not as much as people think. If it did, then tell me how Larry Holmes beats Ray Mercer. A post-Tommy Morrison Ray Mercer. A pre-Lennox Lewis Ray Mercer. Tell me how George Foreman's going the distance with Evander Holyfield. Tell me why George Foreman against some big punchers, right? Shannon Briggs, Tommy Morrison, was able to go the distance against these guys. And that's Foreman in his 40s. Folks, how's that happening? I'll tell you how it's happening. It's because we were underestimating George Foreman, who, like Vladimir Klitschko, took off several years. Didn't have the wear and tear on his body. Also, looked back on his career. Realized he gave away some fights. He should have won the Rumble in the Jungle. All he had to do, he's the champ. Ali had to come take his belt. All he had to do when Ali goes over to the ropes and is motioning to him is wave at him. Say, player, I'm the one with the belt. Why do I have to follow you over to the ropes? What's in it for me? You come here in the middle of the ring, you fight me like a man if we're going to have a fight. Right? I dare the powers that be to strip me of the title in a fight where you're being purely defensive and up on the ropes. So, of course, when Foreman beats Michael Moore, he's wearing the trunks that he wore in the Ali fight, in the Rumble in the Jungle. Right? Foreman looked back. Foreman learned. You don't think that Vladimir Klitschko is looking at the tape of Anthony Joshua getting off the canvas, looking at himself? His brother was in his corner. They were convinced that Joshua was going to run out of steam. You don't think Vladimir Klitschko has asked himself on many a night what he could have done better in that moment? Right? Title fight, by the way. Think about that. So, yeah, I'm excited. Manny Pacquiao's coming back against Mario Barrios. That's a winnable fight. Barrios doesn't use his height. Right? This isn't Jared Ennis who's going to be, leaning back and moving off at the side, Philly shelling, and all this other stuff. No. This is Mario Barrios. Different champion. Right? You can imagine. Vladimir Klitschko, he's going to be fighting Daniel Dubois. He's going to take a step forward, and unlike Tyson Fury, who then would take a step backward, who's ambidextrous, who's moving away, doing all this other crap, Vladimir Klitschko is going to take a step forward, and Daniel Dubois is still going to be standing there. At what point does the older fighter think to himself, this young guy just doesn't know what I know? He hasn't been around as long as I have. At what point does experience take over? Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. Folks, I'm just telling you, a lot of these older fighters have a lot to offer. Let's hope these fights happen. Let me close with this. I want you to think about the age of Arthur Beterbiev. Right, folks? He's an unbeaten champion right now. Folks, if Beterbiev wins the rematch, I think he's looking at a few years of dominance. Right, sure, there are tough fights out there. Benavidez is fighting Morrell. That's happening at 175. Right, but again, power's the last to go. Beterbiev's not a guy relying on hand speed, is he? Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.